Picture for a moment a crowded ballroom shimmering under dazzling chandeliers, filled with socialites wrapped in couture gowns, the murmur of polite conversation mingling with laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Into this glittering world steps an heiress with soft waves of blonde hair and an air of quiet nervousness that seems at odds with the sparkle of her diamonds and the excited hum that follows her wherever she goes. This is Barbara Hutton, the so-called poor little rich girl, an emblem of opulence and glamour whose name once filled gossip columns across continents. She was the American princess with a fortune vast enough to fund her every whim, yet her life story reads more like a heartbreaking tragedy than a fairy tale. From the moment she was born on November 14, 1912, in New York City, to the moment she died alone in a penthouse suite decades later, Barbara Hutton's trajectory was shaped by scandal, misfortune, and the relentless pursuit of something money could never truly secure: a genuine sense of belonging and love. Despite entering the world as the grandchild of Frank W. Woolworth, the magnate behind the legendary Woolworth five and dime empire, and the daughter of Franklin Laws Hutton, co-founder of E.F. Hutton and Company, Barbara's early childhood was defined less by happiness and more by sorrow. Growing up in that whirlpool of wealth, she had every advantage in theory. There were governesses to teach her foreign languages, an endless stream of expensive toys, the run of luxurious homes decorated with priceless art. But the hush that fell over those grand corridors was chilling, punctured by the emptiness that remained after her mother, Edna Woolworth, died when Barbara was only 4 years old. Some claimed Edna's death was from mastoiditis, an infection then more lethal than we might imagine today, while others whispered about poison and suicide, spurred by her husband's well-documented infidelities. Regardless of the truth, what is certain is that a helpless young girl came upon her mother's body in a moment so shocking that it would haunt her for the rest of her life, like a dark cloud she could never fully outrun. The father she might have clung to, Franklin Laws Hutton, proved equally elusive. He remarried, establishing a new life that did not include much room for Barbara. Left in the hands of governesses and well-meaning but distant relatives, she inherited her grandfather's fortune at age 12. That was the moment the world would begin to see her not for the girl she was, but for the massive wealth she commanded. One might think that turning 21 and finally gaining full control of a vast trust fund would be an exhilarating moment, proof of liberation and independence. For Barbara, this milestone arrived in 1933, solidifying her position as one of the wealthiest women on the planet, even while the Great Depression ravaged so many lives around her. This contrast was not lost on the general public, who watched her glamorous escapades with suspicion or outright contempt. Newspapers fanned the flames of resentment, painting her as a living icon of extravagance at a time when millions struggled to afford the basics. When she threw her coming-out ball in 1930, a lavish affair rumored to cost $60,000, a sum unimaginable to most at the time, the press branded her poor little rich girl. It was a name that would stick fast, and though it sounded almost sympathetic on the surface, it came to embody the paradox at the core of her existence. She was drowning in wealth, yet starved for emotional support and love. That emotional emptiness drove her to search for affection in the arms of countless suitors who courted her with a mixture of genuine admiration, opportunism, or some combination of both. Over time, the press would look at her procession of marriages and label them all either foolish or doomed. She walked down the aisle 7 times, each wedding ceremony heralded by the tabloids as the start of another spectacular drama. Her roster of husbands read like an international who's who of titled aristocrats, charming rogues, and even a Hollywood leading man. The first was Alexis Medivani, a Georgian prince who swept her off her feet with an air of foreign mystery. In reality, he was also a man who burned through her money with shocking speed, indulging in polo ponies, gleaming jewelry, and anything else that caught his passing fancy. Barbara's initial experience of marriage thus came laced with betrayal, as her $1 million dowry evaporated in a haze of expensive indulgences. By the time she emerged from that union, the public had begun to see her as an easy mark for fortune hunters. Her second marriage to Count Kurt Haugwitz Reventlow was no less scandalous, but for far darker reasons. This wasn't just a story of squandering money. It was one of bruises and broken bones, of verbal and physical abuse that left her hospitalized. He was a man who coerced her into renouncing her American citizenship to gain certain tax advantages, and took full advantage of her insecurities by belittling and terrorizing her. In this marriage, Barbara Hutton experienced the sobering reality that even a bottomless purse could not shield her from domestic violence. And it was during these terrible years with Haugwitz Reventlow that she gave birth to her only child, Lance Reventlow, in 1936. In Lance, she placed her highest hopes, but motherhood, for her, was complicated. She grappled with her own emotional scars, the demands of an unloving husband, and a society that scrutinized her every move. She wanted deeply to protect her son from the loneliness she had endured as a child, but circumstances and her own vulnerabilities would make this extremely challenging. The Hollywood interlude in her life came when she married Cary Grant in 1942. It's an irresistible image, an heiress who was among the richest women in the world, and an elegant, universally admired movie star who had captured hearts on the silver screen. For a time, they appeared radiant together, sharing sparkling laughter and gliding gracefully through fancy soirees. Yet this union, too, would ultimately unravel. Rumors abounded that Grant was far more indifferent to her emotional well-being than the tabloids wanted to admit, even as he declined to take large financial gifts from her. Headlines began to pun on their names. "Cash and Cary," said the gossip pages, accusing him of living off her wealth despite his own success and implying that her money overshadowed their romance. When their marriage ended in 1945, Barbara had already become disillusioned by repeated disappointment, and the public watched with a mixture of pity and prurient interest, as though waiting for the next scandal to erupt. She found her next scandal in Prince Igor Trubetskoy, whom she married in 1947. He was an adventurous figure known for racing fast cars, a type of glamour that briefly reignited her hopes of finding real love. Yet the relationship teetered under the weight of her own emotional baggage and the unrelenting scrutiny of the press. By the time their union ended in 1951, Barbara's heartbreak was so raw that she attempted suicide, an act that underlined how deeply wounded she truly was behind the glossy magazine covers and the swirl of paparazzi cameras. Then there was the 53-day marriage to the playboy Porfirio Rubirosa, infamous for his globe-trotting lifestyle and rumored affairs with high society women. Barbara, by this point, seemed to be cycling through a destructive pattern, bestowing enormous gifts on these men, planes, lavish estates, luxurious cars, only to find that no gift could secure the devotion and tenderness she yearned for. Rubirosa, like many before him, had no qualms about accepting her generosity. The relationship was short but explosive enough to keep her on the front page of the tabloids, and after it collapsed, she married Baron Gottfried von Kram, a tennis champion and aristocrat in 1955. Again, it was the stuff of tabloids, a worldly baron who seemed dashing and refined. But the marriage ended in 1959, continuing the pattern of heartbreak that had become almost routine. In 1964, she took a final swing at love with Prince Pierre d'Onvin, a union lasting until 1966, and by then the narrative was brutally consistent. Barbara Hutton was the perennial bride, convinced that the next husband would offer the real thing, genuine companionship and emotional safety, only to find more disillusionment. Each new romance was like a glittering present waiting to be unwrapped, but inside, she discovered only an echo of her own loneliness, magnified by the opportunistic impulses of men who saw more dollar signs than they saw the vulnerable woman behind them. All the while, the media breathed down her neck, laying bare every crisis, her lavish gifts, her divorces, her sudden dramatic gestures. Tabloids feasted on her name because she was a living paradox, an heiress whose life was more heartbreak than happiness. She embodied the fantasy of unimaginable wealth, yet also the tragedy of a person unable to find the one thing money could not buy. She had become, in a sense, a performance art piece for the masses. Everyone watched to see what new spectacle would unfold or what sadness would next envelop her. And scandal sold newspapers, so her every misstep, real or rumored, was chronicled, dissected, and sensationalized. Tragedy, that constant shadow over her life, seeped into every corner of her existence. Perhaps the single most devastating event was the plane crash that claimed the life of her beloved son Lance in 1972. He was just 36, visiting Colorado to inspect land, an ordinary enough activity that ended in catastrophic loss. This was the heartbreak that took the last vestiges of her spirit. She blamed herself, as though her maternal failings or her cursed fortune had somehow orchestrated fate. Already fragile from years of disappointment and exhaustion, she spiraled into deeper despair. The heartbreak was so profound that friends would later recall her as a ghost of her former self, carrying the kind of grief that lingers in the eyes and the timbre of a voice. But the pain in Barbara's life wasn't restricted to heartbreak alone. It was also very much physical, manifesting in her struggles with anorexia and substance abuse. Critics had long commented on her figure, pushing her toward extreme dieting that mutated into a life-threatening condition. She lost weight, grew frailer, and found the only solace in painkillers, amphetamines, and alcohol. Vodka-laced Coca-Cola, cigarettes, and prescription drugs became her daily sustenance. Her identity, once defined by wealth, had become inseparable from her physical decline, and she felt trapped by the brand the world had given her. She was poor little rich girl, stuck in a feedback loop of pity, scandal, and sensational coverage. Numerous times, Barbara's desolation drove her to suicide attempts, as though in each moment of crisis she saw no path forward except to end the story altogether. Many people observed her life and asked why, with all her resources, she couldn't just walk away from the toxic environment surrounding her, or find a sense of peace somewhere far away. But the reality was more complex. She was shackled not just by money, but by the illusions it created. People saw her as a walking bank vault, and perhaps she also saw herself that way, unable to break free from that image. Even when she tried to be charitable, such as donating Winfield House in London to the U.S. government, these gestures did little to shift the narrative or alleviate her private anguish. By her later years, a macabre twist had set in. The fortune that once seemed endless was whittled away by the manipulations of husbands and advisors who smelled opportunity, and by her own unrestrained generosity. After all, every new suitor or friend arrived with their hand out, and Barbara, yearning for affection, would frequently give, hoping each lavish gift might invite real warmth in return. Lawyer Graham Madison, among others, came under scrutiny for mismanaging her funds. Bit by bit, the empire that had sustained her grand lifestyle began to crumble. Publicly, there were rumors swirling that she was on the verge of financial ruin, but some couldn't quite believe it. How could someone who had once been so unimaginably rich ever end up with next to nothing? By 1979, Barbara Hutton was 66 years old, a recluse living at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. The penthouse suite where she resided had once been a symbol of luxury, but it now felt more like a gilded cage. Her body was frail, her sight nearly gone from complications related to cataract surgery, and her mind haunted by paranoia. She was convinced her room was bugged, that someone was always watching or waiting to exploit her. A hip injury from a fall in 1971 left her movements limited and painful, further isolating her from the world. She rarely ventured outside those ornate rooms, preferring to receive a small circle of visitors, if any at all. The same tabloids that had once depicted her ball gowns and parties now wrote about her reclusiveness and rumored final collapse of fortune. In early May 1979, she'd been discharged from a hospital after pneumonia treatments. 2 weeks later, on May 11th, her weakened heart finally gave out. The official cause, a heart attack. As with so many turning points in her life, rumor and mystery hung around her last moments. Did she die in despair, or was there any sliver of peace as she slipped away? We can only guess. Journalists quickly jumped on the contradictory reports about her estate. One biographer claimed she had just $3,500 to her name at the end. Others disputed that figure, pointing out that certain holdings might still have been scattered around in trust funds or in physical assets. But regardless of the exact dollar amount, it was painfully clear that the wide gulf between her original fortune and what remained was staggering. When the day arrived for her funeral at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, the turnout was heartbreakingly small. Only about a dozen mourners attended. For a woman who had once been at the pinnacle of wealth and global fame, the solitude of her final farewell was a haunting contrast. She was laid to rest in the Woolworth Mausoleum, the imposing structure that commemorated the family name that had shaped her life in so many ways. Perhaps it was fitting. She returned in death to the family legacy that had been both her greatest blessing and her ultimate curse. Generations later, people still find themselves drawn to her story because it feels as though it belongs in fiction, a soap opera, or an epic drama. Yet it was all too real for Barbara Hutton. Her life reflects the tension between public myth and private anguish, a dilemma that resonates in modern celebrity culture. We see versions of this story retold every time a public figure, lionized for their beauty or wealth, unravels under the weight of mental health struggles, broken relationships, and the endless appetite of the media machine. The difference is that Barbara lived it on a scale that was extraordinary, even by today's standards, propelled by an inheritance that would be mind-boggling in any era. And so, if you imagine her in the final stage of her life, quietly sipping vodka-laced Coke, chain-smoking cigarettes, and flipping through newspapers or magazines that either mocked or pitied her, you might feel a pang of empathy for someone trapped by the circumstances of her birth as much as by her own choices. She was, in the end, a cautionary. If money is power, it is also a lightning rod for opportunists. And if love is elusive, no amount of wealth can truly pin it down. Perhaps that is why Barbara Hutton's story refuses to fade into historical obscurity. It remains a haunting saga of a woman forever entangled with the illusions of grandeur and the harsh reality of human frailty. From the early trauma of losing her mother under suspicious circumstances and finding herself effectively orphaned to the repeated pattern of marriages that promised devotion but delivered heartbreak, each chapter of her life hammered home the price of enormous wealth without the guiding hand of real affection or support. Her one bright light, her son Lance, was torn from her in the most abrupt and tragic way possible. After that, she was never the same, and one senses that the last few years of her life were lived in a purgatory of regret, loneliness, and fear.